Thank you very much for coming today. I would like to start with an observation, which was not made by me, but someone else, that in the 18th century there was a great gap of how intellectuals in Europe and outside Europe, at the fringes of Europe, spoke. In Western Europe, intellectuals, enlightenment philosophers had no scruples of talking about men in general and in the name of men in general. But when their ideas were transferred to the periphery, let's say Russia or Turkey, etc., it was very interesting because intellectuals there started to operate with the distinction them and us. So the position from which they were talking conditioned the almost inability to talk about mankind or human being in general, and it was almost a condition that one should have been speaking in the name of the culture one was in. We could say that currently this very strict distinction no longer operates, not because everything has become part of the center, but in that sense, the center has become part of the periphery. Even in the center, one always talks with this reflection in mind of the place from which one observes reality. And that's why I would say that perhaps we shouldn't ask the question what the work of Hans Ulrich Gumbrext's means in itself or as such, but we can legitimately ask the question what it means to us. One of the reasons for that being that he explicitly thematized this question by talking about Argentinian literature. He said in one of his books that he doesn't want to be engaged in the historical question of who was first and who should be after. Secondly, I think because we don't really find any place from which we can judge the whole corpus, the whole body of the work once and for all, but its meaning is composed or consists of the perspectives which can be developed in reference to it. And when thinking about what this work could and does mean to us, I would say that it's an embodied presence of the humanities. Now, why may I say this sentence? It's because Professor Gumbrext's work is not just the body of work he has authored, and we all know it's a very significant work. More than 40 monographs which he authored or co-authored, more than 30 books he edited, more than 400 scholarly papers and articles he wrote, and countless interventions in the public space. Most of his works having been translated in all major world languages. For us, the meaning of the work of Professor Gumbrext is that it's more than he himself created, because he also represents for us many diverse traditions. It will be the great tradition of Romanist philology, or just a great philological tradition about which he has written critically, but also with great appreciation, and the book he has written about it, about the powers of philology, we can present it today in Georgian translation. I'm very glad that Georgian readers will be able to read it in their own native language. It will be in the shops by the end of the month, by the way. Just kind of signal exemplars. So copies we have here. It's a also great unity of European and North American literary and cultural studies. And we have here to mention the distinguished career of Professor Gumbrexht, having defended his PhD at the age of 22. He became professor at the Bochum University, which is also my own alma mater, and then went to Siegen University, where he founded the first graduate school in humanities in Germany, and then accepted the offer in 1989 to go to Stanford, where he's currently a professor of comparative literature. But also, he, for us, is this embodied presence of the great rupture of the 60s. For us, associated with the names of Derrida, Luhmann, Lyotard, Foucault, and this also great unity of different disciplines, literary criticism and history, cultural criticism and history, history simpliciter, or philosophy and aesthetics. All these disciplines, all these traditions find their expression, fruition, let's say so, in the work created by Professor Gumbrexht, who also extended the scope of humanities beyond what it has been traditionally thought to include, for example, to the domains of sports. Thus, he appears to us as the embodied presence of the humanities, of the present and of the future. And I'm not saying the word presence by chance. If there is a theme, a topic, which we could consider as an overarching motive of the work today in question, this is the motive of presence. Now, it's not necessarily to be understood in the sense most of us know from the history of philosophy, and I mean, of course, this great topic of the overcoming of metaphysics of presence from Heidegger to Derrida, because if I understand Zepp, Brother Gumbrexht, who allows his friends to call him Zepp, his argument is that either there is presence or there is metaphysics. Either there is presence, almost bodily presence, which has its effects, or metaphysics, there is metaphysics, which implies the meanings or search for meanings, and this is an important distinction, but it's definitely not to be understood in this very radical Sontagian sense as a crusade against interpretation. What is suggested in this work is that there is always an oscillation between the effects of meaning and effects of presence, or even I would say a subtle balance between them. And if I could suggest, there is a certain congeniality between the work of Professor Gumbrexht on the one hand, and on the other hand, the Georgian culture, because both are very much centered on this category of presence, or on this experience of presence. And it's interesting if we go in this direction and try to characterize individual cultures as centered either or on presence or on meaning, then of course the current demand for more meaning and more interpretation, more hermeneutics in Georgia would bring to mind this great word of a no longer fashionable thinker. This word is enantiodromia. So the idea that overabundance of something then leads to its opposite. So that's why I was talking about this gentle balance between the two, because without presence, the meaning will be empty, and without meaning, the presence will be blind. And for us, both in academia, of course, both are essential. Essential because we cannot solve their tension once and for all. We cannot allocate to each of them their rightful place and just think about other things. I think one of the functions of the humanities in the university would be to leave this tension and pay more attention to this side which is currently underprivileged or not so prominent, because hollowing out of one of these poles would mean also the hollowing out of the another. This would be the most general significance of the work of Professor Gumbrext's, which we, as the carriers of the current culture, could see, and I'm sure that he will speak about the function of philology and the humanities with far more eloquence. So I would with pleasure give the floor to you.
Thank you so much. I don't know, can you hear me without microphone or? No, okay. Then I do microphone if you like. I mean, I always think that microphones are phallic symbols of academic authority, but if you prefer that, I'll do microphone. Let me begin by saying that I am, and I think my wife and my daughter who came with me to Tbilisi, we are very melancholic because this is our last evening. We actually thought our flight would be tomorrow 3 p.m. We thought we still have half a day. Little did we know that all flights out of Tbilisi are early in the morning, so we leave at 3 o'clock in the morning. And I think that makes us just sad. This has been these past 4 days. We had high expectations. I think this is why they came with me. They normally don't travel with me on academic travel, but they came with me because the expectations about Tbilisi, about Georgia were very high. And I have to say this has been in a different category. It has been so beautiful and so intense to get to know a little bit about Georgian history, a little bit about the intellectual system, what discussions are going on, and I completely agree with Giga, I feel a affinity. We were part of this abundance, of this exuberance, of this intense presence effect of your culture, and it has been overwhelming for 3 days, and we are still very, very grateful to you, Giga, to Tico, and to everybody who has welcomed us with such intensity. It has been absolutely beautiful, and whichever concrete way we will figure out to do that, I want to begin by saying that I think the three of us, and me professionally, have a very, very strong desire to come back. This is not an offer to come back, but I admit it's a desire to come back. I mean, we're going to be very sad tomorrow morning when we leave. Now, in compensation for this melancholia, and I find myself in this melancholia as I start speaking, I do have two things to celebrate. I have to celebrate, this is beautiful for me, for the first time, a book translated into your language, which I will not be able to read in your language. But I think your writing system is so beautiful that it was exciting to see what my name looks like in Georgian writing. I mean, that is very, very beautiful and something to celebrate. And rumor has it that I will get a piece of clothing today that seems to be in acknowledgement of my work. And I mean, I don't know yet officially, but I think this is more my size than Giga's size.
I don't think there's a big distinction.
No, it's actually the same. Yeah, it's the same extra large. But there's certainly reason for me to celebrate. Now, very honestly, I mean, I know normally listening to academic lectures is not a present. I mean, listening to academic lectures is something you have to wear through. And you say, okay, you hope it is over early. I very much hope that this lecture tonight, that really was the idea, was to give you back something. I mean, to give you back something for this beautiful reception here, for this beautiful welcome. And I hope that this lecture is going to be interesting in some way. The title is, I don't know whether we have seen the title, something like, Can the Humanities and Can Philology Survive in an Electronic Environment? In an environment of electronic technology. I mean, I have philology and humanities, because on the one hand, this book on philology is coming out, and on the other hand, I mean, an honorary doctorate in PhD is humanities at large. So I wanted to address these two dimensions. And let me say something. I mean, you all have heard titles like this, Can the Humanities, Can Philology Survive in the present day environment? And normally these are rhetorical questions. You ask that because you already know that the answer is normally 99 out of 100 cases, yes, of course. And I think, however, this is a question that if you care about the humanities, if you care about something like philology, you have to ask this question seriously in the present day environment. You have to allow for the answer to be a potential no. I think if we don't confront this issue, if we don't confront this question, the humanities will not survive. I mean, we have to allow ourselves to think, how would the world react if tomorrow morning the humanities would no longer exist? And think about that. I mean, would anybody outside the humanities know tomorrow morning if the humanities would not exist? I mean, both my wife and my daughter think they wouldn't know. I mean, they would know that I would stay at home, but which would be strange. But these questions are important, and these are questions that I want to ask with you. So the idea is the following. This lecture will have 3 parts. I will first give you a brief story, my story, of philology. And I think philology can best be characterized as a skill. Yeah, philology is a skill. What is the history of philology as a skill? I think it starts in the 3rd century BC and goes until the present day. In the second part, I will present you a history of the humanities. And I think the humanities, I mean, have been existing as Geisteswissenschaften in the German sense since the 1890s. It happened at the now Humboldt University at Berlin that the Geisteswissenschaften were invented as a cluster of disciplines. But I think they already existed from the early 19th century on. I think this is a history that starts in the early 19th century and goes on. So I will try to give you these 2 histories. I mean, history of philology, history of the humanities, which are in a way, because the humanities is really a cluster of academic disciplines, which are in a way much less connected than we normally think. There is a connection, but this connection is complicated, and it will be one of the things I try to explain how they are connected. And I will then really try to challenge us. I mean, in the present day environment, under present day conditions, do they have a possibility, but also do they have a function to survive? What can the humanities be today? And my answer will not be unconditionally positive in the end. I mean, I'm quite skeptical about the survival of the humanities. Let me say one thing. I don't know whether we have a discussion, but we certainly have a reception after that. One of the reasons why I chose to talk about the history of philology and the history of the humanities is because I would love to know more about the history of the humanities, but also and specifically about the history of philology under Georgian conditions. I believe having a writing system that is exclusively yours almost necessarily creates the expectation that the history of philology under Georgian conditions must be different from the history of philology, for example, in Germany or, for example, in Italy. So I hope that both in your questions and in our discussions you tell me a little bit that this is the beginning of me learning about your culture. Okay, so 3 parts. Difficult to say. I mean, I was saying that already in my lecture on Monday, how long this will be. We don't know each other. You still, again, like on Monday, look very serious. A little bit less serious than on Monday. Some people know it helps if you smile or not, or shake your head. But I would say this is again a 40-45 minute lecture, after which everything will happen quickly. So But if you are polite enough like now to laugh my jokes and so forth, and it can be a little bit longer, it can be a little bit shorter. Okay, let's get started. History of philology. I am kind of a decimal fetishist. I like to say, so this history is going to be so and so many parts. So it will be 6 brief steps in the history of philology. And let's emphasize, I don't think philology has ever been a discipline. You know, philology is a skill that for the longest time was outside the university, and a skill that even within the university, there has never been professorships for philology. I mean, philology was a certain competence that you had to have if you were working in the humanities or in literary studies or sometimes in philosophy, but it is a skill. Now, what I think that skill starts in the 3rd century BC, and it starts in the context of the Library of Alexandria. What I find interesting about it is it starts under conditions of looking back. The 3rd century BC looks back to the 5th and the 4th century BC, believing that those previous centuries were greater, were more important. Yeah? Philology starts under the threat that you might forget something that was more important than what is available today. So philology is right from the start text curatorship. Text curatorship. You want to preserve texts in a way that is not assured, and you want to provide and preserve accessibility to text. So there is no Plato in the 3rd century, there is no Aristotle in the 3rd century, and there's a strong awareness of that, and this makes philology text curatorship. Is that clear? So I will say that the skill is really preserving texts and preserving knowledge throughout the centuries in a situation where you think you have something to lose. I mean, the threat that makes philology alive is always the threat that you may forget something, that you may lose something. You have to preserve something. It is in the literal sense of the word, not in the political sense of the word. Philology is conservative. It is about conserving something. But there is one more important condition about that, and I would like to say that it was my idea, this other condition, but unfortunately it is the idea of a Stanford colleague whom I admire a lot and like very little, and that is my French colleague at Stanford, Michel Serres. Michel Serres in a book recently said, and I think this is very, very important, that since the invention of linear writing, and this is different in Asian languages, textuality has been the one and only Western form of preserving knowledge. So there is no other form in the West to preserve knowledge but text. And text is the basic unit of preserving knowledge, and that means that philology, by preserving texts, is not only text curatorship, but the central curatorship of knowledge. I mean, philology makes knowledge accessible. Philology makes knowledge accessible by preserving texts, by putting them on shelves, in whichever form, by making them accessible, by writing catalogs, and so forth and so forth. Is that clear? So first point, since the 3rd century BC, philology is text curatorship and knowledge curatorship. Now, second step in the history of philology, and this is specifically Western, since the 1st century AD, since the conservation of the letters of St. Paul, and you all know the oldest Christian texts are not the 4 Gospels, but the letters of St. Paul, and then the 4 Gospels, philology has the task to preserve the Word of God. To preserve the Word of God. God will not come back to the world. To preserve the Word of God. And there's something very strange about preserving the Word of God, because you preserve the Word of God in a language that was not Christ's language. There's no philology of Aramaean. There's a philology about preserving the text in ancient Greek, preserving the text in Latin, and so forth and so forth. So philology becomes not only text curatorship, not only knowledge curatorship, but curatorship of the knowledge provided by God. Curatorship of the revelation provided by God. Third step, and I think this is when philology really had its heroic age, this is this bottleneck of the early and high Middle Ages. I mean, everything we know from ancient classical culture, Greek culture, ancient Roman culture, went through about 2,500 manuscripts that existed around 900. So there was very, very little, and it is due to very few monasteries that everything we knew about classical antiquity was preserved. I mean, some of you may know that nobody knew around 900 about Plato. This came all back through Arabic culture. But there is this heroic moment of philology where everything that we know from ancient culture, from pre-medieval culture, from pre-Christian culture, went through this very small group of text curatorship. That would be step 3. So you see, this is not a genealogical history. This is not a history that leads to a culminating point. This is a history about different steps. Now we'll make a 4th step and make a philosophical claim that is important, and I come back to this concept that Giga was mentioning, this concept of presence. I think from the 17th century on, 17th, 18th century on, philology becomes, in its practice and as a skill, much more rational than it was ever before. And here is my argument about what I associate with rationality and what I associate with Descartes, and what I mean when I'm saying I think in principle, and this is a general rule, this is about humankind, we have a double relationship to every intentional object. I mean, if something is constituted as an object on our mind, and I call it intentional object in the sense of Husserl, then we always and inevitably have a double relationship to that. We have a relationship of interpretation, of attribution of meaning. I mean, we cannot have an intentional object without trying to attribute meaning to it. You know that, for example, if I was talking in a language that you don't know, if I could speak Mandarin, for example, and nobody here would understand Mandarin, you cannot help trying to attribute meaning to it, although you know you don't know this language. But at the same time, I think inevitably, if we have an intentional object, we have a spatial relationship to it. So for example, while you're hearing me, you establish a spatial relationship to where I'm sitting, from where I'm speaking to you, where you see me, etc., etc. There's a spatial relationship whose basic distinction is actually tangibility or non-tangibility. Yeah? I mean, Giga is present to me because I can touch him and he can touch me. I mean, everybody who's sitting here in the room is present. But if you record what I'm saying and play it for somebody tomorrow, I'm not going to be present in that sense. Yeah? I'm going to be present in a different sense because there will be sound waves, etc., etc. Now what I'm saying is that the decisive cultural distinction and difference that we associate with early modernity is precisely that from early modernity on, the presence relationship gets bracketed. From early modernity on, the presence relationship plays no role. This is Martin Luther in his interpretation of real presence. Yeah? Martin Luther says, no, this cannot mean this is my blood and this is my body. What Christ really meant is this represents my blood, this represents my body. You get the point. I mean, Catholic and Orthodox theology is on the real presence side, but Catholic and Orthodox theology looks so weird, so unacceptable, so non-modern since early modernity. You get my point? Because you bracket the present side. Yeah? And if you say, being Descartes, I think, therefore I am, that means that the entire ontology of human existence can be subsumed under consciousness. I mean, your somatic, your physical life, your presence life is bracketed, is not part of your existence. Is that clear? I'm not saying this is good, I'm just describing something historically. From that moment on, philology became largely hermeneutic, became based on interpretation, was excluding the materiality of text. From that moment on, and let me introduce that also from the 18th century on, only from the 18th century on, we have a concept in Western culture of aesthetics that is similar to the way we use that word today. I think when we talk about an experience that is aesthetic, we refer to an experience where you can not only have meaning attribution, where the presence dimension plays a role. Yeah? For example, when you listen to a poem, somebody recites a poem, and when somebody recites a poem, you cannot only concentrate on the meaning, you cannot only interpret, you cannot only be hermeneutic, at the same time, you are exposed to the prosody, you are exposed to rhyme, to rhythm, to verse, and so forth and so forth. So get my point, since the 17th, 18th century, on the one hand, our intellectual life was exclusively based on meaning attribution, trying to exclude the presence dimension, and whatever included the presence dimension, I mean exceptionally, think of an opera, think of music for example, was called aesthetic. Is that clear? Or shall I repeat it? It's an important point for what I want to say. So from the, once again, from the 17th century on, I'm not talking about human culture, I'm talking about Western culture. Everything that we call rational, everything that has an intellectual prestige excludes the presence dimension. And we talk about aesthetics in those exceptional cases where the attribution of meaning was combined with the presence component. Yeah? Where we had, as Giga was saying, quoting me, an oscillation between presence and meaning. When we listen to a poem that is being recited, we can either concentrate more on the semantics, on the content of the poem, or we can concentrate more on the prosody. But yes, I think there can be a balanced relationship, but it is always precarious. Is that clear? Fifth step in the history of philology. So the fourth step is really philology becomes almost coextensive with hermeneutics, with interpretation. Fifth step, around 1800, and I've been talking about that on Monday evening, this is the emergence of the historical worldview. So from the early 19th century on, philology becomes much more historical. Yeah? This is the moment when all of a sudden the original text becomes decisive. For those among you who know the history of philology, this is Lachmannian in the sense of the German medievalist Lachmannian philology. You put texts together and try to reconstruct what was the original text. You put texts in a trajectory. This is what philology did absolutely not do until around 1800. But from 1800, philology becomes historical. And I actually think that what we have been calling philology in the 19th and in the 20th century didn't change much. I would say when I was a student in the 1960s, early 1970s, you had to acquire the skill of philology if you were in literary studies, but it was absolutely the most boring thing. I mean, nobody who wanted to be modern, nobody who wanted to be intellectually interesting would do philology. I mean, philology was something that very old, retired professors would do. And what is the final stage of philology? And this is the challenge really, and this is the present. You realize that since the invention of electronic technology, this absolute relationship between textuality on the one side and knowledge on the other side does no longer exist. Yeah? I mean, on a computer screen, or on the screen of your cell phone, knowledge is still articulated in a textual way. But we do not imagine that knowledge is stored in a textual way. Yeah? So the storage, we don't really know how this storage functions. I mean, it functions somehow in relationship to silicon, but it functions in a different way. And this, of course, would completely change the status of philology. Yeah? I mean, if philology all of a sudden continues to be text curatorship, but is no longer knowledge curatorship, it has a different status. It is maybe less important than it used to be. And this is precisely why I'm asking about philology. The question, can philology survive? If philology being text curatorship is no longer at the same time absolutely knowledge curatorship, we have the question, can philology survive? Okay, so this is my brief history of philology. Of course, one can tell it in many different ways, but I would claim that these different points, different steps are relatively important, and I hope you have understood the point about presence. Yeah? I mean, from the 17th, 18th century on, The presence dimension is bracketed. If you want to be reasonable, you don't include the presence dimension. If you want to be aesthetic, you include it, but that's a different story. Now, the history of the humanities, which is a strange history because I think it begins 100 years avant la lettre. I mean, the humanities, die Geisteswissenschaften, the humanities and arts, as we say in the Anglo-American context, have only been described as a cluster of disciplines, of academic disciplines, since the late 19th century. But I think they have been existing since the early 19th century. And I think not so much because I happen to be a literary critic, a literary historian. They first articulated themselves in a modern way in literary studies in the early 19th century. So when I talk about the humanities and when I talk about literary studies, I do not talk about a skill. I talk about an academic institution. And I think this academic institution did not exist before the early 19th century. There was, of course, philosophy as a practice. There was history as a practice. There were people talking about literature. Think, for example, of Aristotle's Poetics, but it was not an academic discipline. Why does literary studies and why do the humanities come into being as an academic discipline in the early 19th century? Okay, this is my first question. My thesis is that the humanities coming into being, people like the Grimm brothers becoming professors at humanities. Both Grimm brothers became professors of Germanistic at the University of Marburg in 1814. And this was for the first time that there was a chair for German literature. Why? I think this has to do with an asymmetry, with a tension, a social tension that did not exist before the bourgeois revolutions, between the Glorious Revolution in England, before the Revolution of 1789 in France, before the American Revolution 1776. And this distinction is a tension between the everyday experience in society, on the one hand, and what the bourgeois revolutions had promised people to be the normative image of society. Yeah? I mean, there is, since the bourgeois revolutions, for example, the concept of the citoyen, of the citizen, of the Bürger, who has rights of equality. Something like that didn't exist before. And very soon, in the early 19th century, and we could easily document that, people discover that there is a tension between what people experience in society, on the one hand, and what is the normative image of society. So equality, for example, is equality of rights, is suggested, should happen, but people say it doesn't really happen. Is that clear? This does not exist before the bourgeois revolutions, because before the bourgeois revolutions, there was no normative image of what life should be like. There were utopian images of life, but this was paradise. But that there was a claim that you would say, well, the state has promised me to have equal rights. This has to happen was a challenge and a tension that only existed in the early 19th century. Is that clear? The early 19th century in the Western context. Now, I think we can observe what helped to mediate that tension since the early 19th century was what we call leisure time, Mußezeit. Not exclusively literature, but the way people started reading literature in Romanticism. Yeah? And it helped in two ways, either by mediation, by trying to convince people that in reality this tension was not as dramatic as they experienced, or by compensation. And that means by offering you in literature what the normative image of society had promised you without keeping it in reality. So there were two ways of using literature from the early 19th century on in order to mediate between this normative image of society and everyday experience of society, one being mediation, the other being compensation. And my thesis is that literary studies and the humanities avant la lettre, without having a name yet, come into being to fulfill this function. I think literary studies comes into being in the early 19th century by proposing pedagogies of reading. You should read like this, and if you read like this, it would be good. I mean, this pedagogy of reading, and the other function would be that from the early 19th century on, literary studies contributes to the illustration of this normative image of society. Of this normative image of society, what should society be like? So get my point? I mean, humanities start by making contributions to this mediation between normative image of society and everyday experience of society, and by making contributions to the illustration of what society should be like. Now, there were two different modalities of that happening. In those nations where there had been a successful bourgeois revolution, and that would be England, that would be France, and that would be the United States, this illustration of the normative image of society was non-historical. So I don't know whether anybody here knows the name of Matthew Arnold. He normally has the role of the founding father of literary studies in England. Matthew Arnold famously said, we use all literatures from all different nations in order to illustrate what is a good life. And that means that in England, in France, and in the United States, literary studies begin in a non-historical way. Yeah? You go back to ancient Greece, but you deal with Sophocles as if he was a contemporary author. And they also start in a non-national way. Yeah? Matthew Arnold talks about Sophocles, he talks about Euripides, he talks about medieval authors, he talks about Shakespeare, but he doesn't feel that being an English professor, he has to specifically focus on Shakespeare. Yeah? In those countries where there had been no successful bourgeois revolution, like in the first place Germany didn't exist, as you know, like Italy, for example, like Spain, trying to produce a normative image of society happened by going back into the past. And that is what we call Romanticism. And this is what the Grimm brothers were doing. The Grimm brothers were, so to speak, anthropologists who talked to people in German villages. By talking to people in German villages, tried to reconstruct what German culture in the 13th, 12th, 11th century had been. We know today that they didn't really find out what it had been, but they projected something. And they elevated their impression of what German medieval culture was to making it normative. So that means in those countries, in Germany above all, Grimm brothers, in Italy above all, in the Italy that tried to reconstitute itself as a nation, in Spain in the 19th century, you go back in literary studies, in the humanities, to the past in order to produce a normative horizon of society. Is that clear? So there are two different modalities. How the humanities start in different Western nations. Now, this was relatively long, but I get the impression that you were not completely bored, I hope at least. Second point is very brief. I think the age of glory of the humanities is the 19th century and not the 20th century. Because in the 19th century, and I quote somebody whom both Giga and I admire and like a lot, Wolfgang Iser, in the 19th century, in the bourgeois society of the 19th century, the humanities become the pseudo-theology for the bourgeois society. Yeah, by saying what the normative image of society would be, what society would be like. You could say that culture in the 19th century, literature, but imagine something like Wagner, for example, in Bayreuth. Culture increasingly in bourgeois society takes the place of religion, and the humanities, above all literary studies, become, so to speak, the theology of that culture. So during the 19th century, the normative image of society, what society should be, is being provided by the humanities. This is why the prestige of the humanities in the 19th century was larger than ever before and after. I'll give you one example. From the foundation of the Second German Empire on, after the Franco-Prussian War, 1871, the New Year's speech to the German nation was given either by the Emperor, William I, or by Wilamowitz Moellendorff, the most eminent professor of classics. I mean, can you imagine today a professor of classics in the United States alternating with Obama giving the New Year's speech? Completely unimaginable. So the humanities and literary studies in the 19th century had an enormous prestige as being the pseudo-theology for the bourgeois society of the 19th century. Is that clear? I think the situation changes, and changes dramatically, in the late 19th century. And I think it changes dramatically basically for two reasons. From the late 19th century on, the humanities at the university are in a competition with the sciences. Yeah? I mean, the late 19th century, think of biology, think of medicine, think of all the inventions, for example, X-rays in my hometown, 1895. All of a sudden, the natural sciences produce a new life, produce a new society. Natural sciences feed into a new technology. Whereas the humanities, who had not really been separated from the natural sciences, stay behind. In the second place, we can observe that what the humanities had been doing during the 19th century, namely to provide, to illustrate a normative horizon of society, is no longer convincing. Yeah? Think of somebody like Nietzsche, for example. I mean, Nietzsche's entire work is precisely undercutting the pseudo-theological function of the humanities, the pseudo-theological function. I mean, a book like Beyond Good and Evil, for example, is precisely doing that, undercutting this claim that philosophy, philology, can tell you how to lead your life. And I think the foundation of the humanities, as Geisteswissenschaften, is a passive reaction to that. Yeah? It was the philosopher Dilthey, who was dean at Berlin, who, in order to exclude empirical psychology from the humanities, founds the humanities, the Geisteswissenschaften. And I think it is a passive-aggressive move from early on, passive-aggressive deliberately. As my daughter is a psychologist, I'm curious what she says about me saying that the foundation of what I represent in the university is a passive-aggressive reaction. Now, how does Dilthey define the humanities? Dilthey defines the humanities by saying that all disciplines that are based on interpretation, on attribution of meaning, he uses the German Greek word organon, all disciplines whose organon is interpretation, is attribution of meaning, is, as I would say, metaphysics, are the humanities. But I think, and this is the passive-aggressive mood, that the humanities start in a way with a birth trauma. The humanities start with an awareness that they exclude what is modern life, that they exclude the sciences, that they exclude presence. And I think the humanities, and you may notice that until the present day, are born with this birth trauma of resentment. Have you realized that humanities professors are always full of resentment? They always think they do not earn enough. They always think they are not recognized enough at the university. They always feel that the social scientists get too much prestige, the engineers get too much prestige. I mean, Stanford is a typical place for that. I think we are very, very good in the humanities at Stanford. But at the same time, many of my colleagues at Stanford has, I'm very proud of that, 22 active Nobel laureates, of course none of them being in the humanities. And as Stanford is the center of Silicon Valley, so to speak, they always act as if they are in the diaspora. Yeah? I mean, so I think humanities professors and humanities students have a certain tendency of playing, of being in the diaspora, of developing a certain resentment. This may be the reason, and this is a fourth step, why in the period between the two wars, entre deux guerres, between World War I and World War II, we have the absolute demise of the humanities. I mean, the performance of the humanities, especially but not exclusively literary studies, in the Soviet Union and in Nazi Germany was absolutely worse, and in a way disqualified these disciplines forever. I mean, you know more about the adaptation of literary studies and the humanities to Soviet state ideology. I will give you one example from Germany, from Germanistic and from German philosophy. When the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, a book was produced under the title Von deutscher Art in Sprache und Dichtung. And the best Germanists and the best German philosophers were invited to make contributions to prove the racial superiority of Aryans over Slavs. Yeah? And actually there are very few important German philosophers and literary critics and historians who did not contribute to this book, which was supposed to be part of the equipment of each German officer invading the Soviet Union. Yeah? I mean, I think and hopefully not many of those officers were reading the book, but it is still in all libraries. Well, actually interesting whether you have it in any library here in Tbilisi. Yeah? I mean, it is the absolute demise of the humanities, and I think it has to do with the fact that the humanities had this ambition to find a function. Yeah? The humanities are founded with this resentment we have lost the function. And there is this ambition between 1918 and 1945 to play a function within totalitarian systems, which led to the worst moment in the history of the humanities. Now the next step would be that, at least in the West, after 1945, you have a time, so to speak, of detoxification. Yeah? You have a time when the humanities try to be absolutely free of ideology. Yeah? It is the time when, in the Anglo-American context, the humanities cultivate new criticism. New criticism just means to read a text and to focus only on the text and to avoid any ideological interpretation. In the German context, you have what was called in West Germany immanent interpretation. Same thing, you focus only on the text. But then something strange happens, that from the 1960s on, think of structuralism, for example, think of the rediscovery of Saussure, think of Lévi-Strauss, and then from a new reception of Marxism and so forth, for half a century, the humanities display a firework of theories. Yeah? I mean, from 1960 to the 1990s, I mean, there was always this question, what's cutting edge? What's new in the humanities? Yeah? I mean, you have neo-Marxism, you have reception theory, you have deconstruction, you have new historicism, you have identity theories, you have gender theories, and so on and so on. There's enormous explosion of theoretical contributions coming out of humanities, and at the same time, I believe, a growing loss of prestige. I mean, the more the humanities produced eccentric theories within the universities, the more they lost prestige outside the university. I mean, as some of you know, as Giga knows from some of the stories I have been telling the past days, I happen to know somebody like Jacques Derrida relatively well. I had a sympathy for him. I've never been a deconstructor. But I think something like deconstruction, not deconstruction exclusively, has done an absolutely horrible job for the outside prestige of the humanities. Yeah? I mean, it is like from the 1970s, 1980s on, that very few people from outside the humanities believe that the humanities could ever make an important contribution. So this makes us arrive with the humanities around 2000. What is the present situation of the humanities? I don't know about Georgia, but I think worldwide one can say that the tendency is that the enrollment in the humanities, speaking from an American point of view, both on the undergraduate level and on the graduate level, is going down. Yeah? I mean, there is not a single humanities discipline, I believe, where enrollment is stable or growing worldwide. Enrollment is going down. Secondly, I think this explosion of new theories, this productivity, this intellectual productivity, that did not contribute to the prestige of the humanities, but you could say internally it was exciting, has ended. I mean, if today you teach a history of the humanities, you can basically stop in the 1990s, because not many new things have emerged since the 1990s. I'm not saying that the quality of the work, the intellectual quality today is worse than in the 1990s, but this constant new production, there's a new theory, yet a new theory, has stopped. And I would say that also the prestige of the humanities has been relatively low. You could actually say when the humanities with Dilthey had established themselves as being metaphysical, as providing a profound interpretation of the world, as providing an interpretation of the world, an in-depth interpretation that nobody outside the humanities had the consequence and the time to produce and to provide. We are now in a situation where our worldview is produced due to electronic technology in a different way. I mean, our worldview today is produced by processing electronically an enormous amount of data. I mean, an amount of data that nobody could ever have processed without the humanities. And this enormous amount of data being processed produces a worldview that is no longer based on a metaphysical interpretation. So, our situation today is that on the one hand, philology, the skill of philology, has lost its prestige because textuality is no longer the exclusive form of preservation of knowledge. And on the other hand, the humanities, the Geisteswissenschaften, are in a precarious situation because their founding claim, the founding claim of being metaphysical, has been challenged or is being challenged by what now produces our worldviews in the electronic age, namely the result of a processing of data that is so enormous that we cannot compare, we cannot compete with interpretation. Now, this brings me to the final stretch. I had said to Giga I would speak 45 minutes. I think I need another 10 minutes, then we'll be done. So what is the situation today? What is the situation today? Not only the situation of the humanities and philology, but our existential situation today. I mean, in the first place, this function of curatorship is taken away from philology. In the second place, the claim of a profound interpretation of the world is taken away from the humanities. At the same time, and this is our existential situation, I think we are more and more working in professions, even in formerly proletarian professions, where our everyday consists in a fusion between consciousness and software. I mean, most of us here spend most of our everyday working in front of a computer screen, and that means that is a fusion between our consciousness and the software with which we are interacting, and that means that in a more dramatic way than ever before, our body, the dimension of space, the somatic dimension of our life is eliminated. We do really not know what to do with that. I mean, in Georgia that may be true for half of the population because you have still a very basic agricultural situation as I saw driving through the country. But for most professions you live in a fusion between software and your consciousness. And it is not clear what we do with the presence dimension, what we do with the somatic dimension, the corporeal dimension of our lives. There is a second dimension that I think really profoundly changes in our existence, once again due to electronic technology. I think we can say for the 20th century that most people in Western cultures, and by Western culture I clearly include your culture, I mean Western culture excluding Asian culture, for example, experience their everyday as a field of contingence, as a field of contingency, I mean, most phenomena that you saw could be interpreted in different ways. You could have different political parties, you could have different opinions on certain historical circumstances, different interpretations of World War II, for example, etc., etc. But when you said the world is a field of contingents, you had two cushions, so to speak. On the one side, certain things that were necessary, that were fate, that you could not change, like, for example, the sex into which you were born. That was traditionally, it's okay, you were born as male or female or something in between, but you could not change that. So it was contingents with necessity on the one side and impossibility on the other side. There was a certain amount of phenomena that we could imagine, but we believed that they would never become real. Now, I think in that case also, largely due to the calculation power of electronic technology, these two cushions of what is necessary and fate on the one hand, and what seems to be impossible, although imaginable on the other hand, is melting away. Yeah, I mean, today, and I think once again largely due to electronic technology, we begin to have gender transformation, transsexual surgery as a possibility. It is certainly far from being ideal, so to speak, but if I remember, like 30 years ago, that was still unimaginable. And today, I mean, my granddaughter who is 7-year-old, her best friend is actually a girl who's genetically a boy. And the parents are preparing the first transsexual surgery. And she will probably have a life as a girl, or he will probably have a life as a girl that's an acceptable life. That was completely unimaginable 30, 40 years ago. Yeah? So my point is, I'm not saying this will happen perfectly in the future, but what used to be fate, what used to be necessary, is no longer necessary. And on the other side, certain things that used to be absolutely impossible, although imaginable, like eternal life. Eternal life has become a possibility that we can imagine. Eternal life has become, so to speak, a medical research project. You get my point? We are in a situation where we gain enormously possibilities, where we gain enormously freedom, where we have maybe an excess of freedom. We have so many things we can choose from that we are lacking things to hold on to. And I think it is precisely this situation, this existential situation, where we are losing possibilities of inhabiting space, of inhabiting our existence with our body, of having so many possibilities that nothing seems necessary or impossible anymore. I think this is a situation where the humanities could have new possibilities. And this is what I'm proposing in this book, Powers of Philology, and what I'm proposing also with my present theory. Let me finish by giving you a brief survey of what I'm trying to do with this book, The Powers of Philology. When I'm saying power, I'm defining power as the potential of violence. You know, violence would be the invasion of spaces with bodies against the resistance of other bodies. And if you say you have power, you have that possibility without playing it out. And I'm using this concept, the powers of philology, in the book in the sense that the philology has a power to bring the body back into our existence, to bring presence back into our existence. It does not necessarily happen, but it could happen. And what I'm trying to argue in the different chapters by saying philology could be a way of bringing presence, of bringing the corporeal part of our life back into our existence. What I'm trying to say is in the first chapter that, for example, collecting fragments of texts, we should allow, when we collect fragments, to live, to experience the fragment as a text like a wound. Yeah? You have a sheet of paper or a sheet of parchment, and it is ripped off. You only have a part of it. And we should allow ourselves, Benjamin talks about that in a passage, to feel that this is something like a wound, and precisely this feeling that there is a wound allows you to project what the entire text might be. I say in the second chapter, when editing a text, we should allow ourselves to be the author of that text, even in a physical way, who would have written down this text. Or we should allow ourselves to imagine that we would be the person to recite this text. I mean, the person to embody this text. I'm saying when we do commentary, and this is the Georgian quality, we should allow ourselves to be abundant. Yeah? A good commentary is a rich commentary. A good commentary is not only the necessary commentary. Commentary is good if it provides you more than you actually need. I'm saying when we historicize, we should not only have something at a distance, but when we historicize, we should try to conjure up the past, to produce the impression that the past is present. Yeah? I'm trying to teach, when I'm trying to speak about the year 1926, for example, I have a book on that here. My ideal would be for my readers in certain moments to think they are in the year 1926. So we should allow ourselves this, if you want, naive immersion into the past. And I finally think when we are teaching, we should not only teach in a metaphysical way. We should not only teach by saying this means X, this poem by Goethe, or this poem by a great Georgian author means this or that, but we should just point to things as a possibility. Yeah? My wife is an artist, and I like to point to her paintings. I mean, she's an abstract painter. It looks a little bit like Rothko, like Jackson Pollock, and you point to that. I think you cannot interpret Jackson Pollock, you cannot interpret Rothko. It doesn't mean anything. But you can show your students, you can point to that. Or I can show my students the enthusiasm that I feel when I recite a Hölderlin poem. And maybe showing this enthusiasm, being deictic about it, is more important existentially today under electronic circumstances than acting as if I could tell them what it exactly means. So you get my point. This book, The Powers of Philology, is a pledge, an argument that the skill of philology can find a function today in the specific existential situation of today if we allow it to acquire, to reacquire that dimension of presence that has been eliminated from philology in the 17th, 18th century. And I want to finish by saying that perhaps rather than being hermeneutic within the humanities and within literary studies, we should allow ourselves more in the humanities to trigger, to activate imagination. So the final key word I want to deal with is imagination. What do I mean when I say imagination? I mean by imagination an intentional object, something that I have on my mind that has not been filtered yet, that has not been neutralized yet, that has not been dried out yet by a concept. Yeah, for example, you hear a noise, you hear a voice, you hear some noise, and you imagine an animal, or you imagine a person. And imagination would be the energetic, lively image of that, before you say, well, this is this type of an animal, or it is this person. And that means that imagination in the second place does not only have this liveliness that conceptual knowledge does not have. Imagination also has, and you all know that from your daydreams, imagination also has an immediate relationship to our body. Yeah? Living in imagination is a form of existence that tendentially reintegrates the presence component of our existence. Now, normally we associate imagination with aesthetic autonomy. We associate imagination, we associate the possibility of a text, of a literary text, trigger our imagination with the lack of a necessity to find out exactly what somebody wants to tell me. I mean, for example, you read James Joyce's Ulysses, or you read Musil's Man Without Qualities, and if you read these texts under the premises of aesthetic autonomy, then you have no necessity to find out exactly what James Joyce meant, or exactly what Musil meant, or exactly what your favorite author meant. You have the possibility, under the premises of aesthetic autonomy, of these texts letting turn on your imagination, and by letting them turn on your imagination, recuperate a more full way of human existence, a way of human existence that includes presence effects, and that includes also effects of soma, effects of sensuality. And this was the argument that I tried to make on Monday evening, and I don't know whether we agree on that. This is why I think it is good for the humanities to be an ivory tower, to be at a distance from society, to not constantly have to prove their practical value. Yeah, to be able to have philosophical discussion that is allowed to trigger your imagination without you necessarily finding out what Heidegger meant or what Aristotle meant in a certain moment. I think this is important, but this is only one possibility. I do believe that the humanities will have a future. I'm not assured that they will have a future. But the humanities might have a future in the present day situation where we are lacking imagination, if you let this happen. If you let this aesthetic autonomy of the ivory tower be the condition of the humanities, where you allow for a class to trigger an imagination that is not necessarily what the professor wanted to say, but the professor helping you to recuperate a fuller form of existence. And after 3 or 4 days in this country, realizing, and this was my impression, how everything you talk about, how everything you eat, how everything you listen to in Georgia always already has this premise of aesthetic abundance. I think you are in a brilliant position, in a brilliant situation of doing humanities this way, maybe in a much better situation than some of the EU countries and maybe even the Anglo-American countries. And this is one reason why I really want to come back to this university and try and teach a humanities seminar. So many thanks.
Thank you so much for this rich and fascinating presentation. And I can assure you that the effects of the presence were felt beyond the understanding of meaning. And just a small remark, for example, your talk about the pseudo or quasi-theology of culture has explained, for some of us definitely, why was that right after the fall of the Soviet Union, philologists and specialists in cultural history came to power, not only in Georgia, but in the whole of the region. And there was a case when there was no alternation between the holder of the political power and the philologists, but there was a unity of the first president speaking about the Georgian literature as a president, that this was a kind of the thought as the very important part of self-understanding, which didn't end well, actually. I think that we can open for just a couple of questions before the short ceremony with which we will end today's this evening, and afterwards we can continue in more informal fashion to interact with them. So please.
The more you, I mean, you ask the questions you want to ask, but as I was saying at the beginning, the more the questions come, like Giga's commentary, from the specific situation here, the better for me, because what I was saying at the ending, yes, you end such a lecture on a friendly note, But I think you have seen enough of my reactions to the country that I do think you have a specific possibility, I don't know about the university, but from your culture, to practice humanities in this very specific way.
So?
Out of politeness, we need 2 questions.
Please. Bella?
I would like to ask you about the theory of Marcel Corby-Spock, if you accept this theory that in 19th century in European countries, especially in Germany, nationalism was institutionalized and established as a discipline, and thanks to at the universities, thanks to German romanticists, and thanks to this process, the nationalities and national ideas were developed in European countries, larger and as well as especially smaller European countries like Eastern European countries and Georgia as well, since we had to prove our national self-image through this national status of nationalism. Would you say the same about American literature and the role of American literature and humanities in establishing American nation?
It sounds horrible because I'm an American citizen and proud of it. I mean, I hope you all feel the provocation. You normally don't say in Europe that you're proud to be an American citizen. So here I have a theory for that. I mean, I would say France, for example, I mean, literary studies in France, and for those among you who are specialists of French literature, the equivalent of the Grimm brothers in France is Paulin Paris, the father of Gaston Paris. Yeah? Now, Paulin Paris was a librarian at the Royal Bibliothèque Royale, who, like Matthew Arnold, was just going through all periods of French literature, medieval, Renaissance, 18th century, and found all these texts beautiful. Yeah? So there was no historical dimension, no philological dimension in literary studies. Literary studies in France becomes historical and nationalist immediately after the 1870-71 defeat in the Franco-Prussian War. Gaston Paris, the son of Paulin Paris, had announced as a professor at Collège de France a survey of historical grammar of French. And after the defeat, he scratches that title and says he will give a lecture on the Song of Roland, on the national epic, because in this moment of national humiliation, we have to rejuvenate the image of our own nation in order to bounce back. I mean, this is basically the project of World War I in a way. Yeah? So the point is that I think most nations during the 19th century, due to such a moment of defeat, yeah? This is the case in Italy, this is the case in Spain, 1898, this is the case with France. Most of the nations most of the philologies became very nationalist, very nationalistic. I mean, the German case being very horrible because this led exactly into the servility with Nazi Germany in the 1930s and 1940s. There are 2 exceptions, and these exceptions are England. I think literary studies in England never turned really historical, only late with people, I mean, with neo-Marxists. Yeah? I mean, in the 60s, 70s, I mean, with people like Terry Eagleton, you have something that becomes historical, but it never becomes national. And indeed, it never becomes national in the United States, proof being that there is no American national philology. Yeah? If you look at any English department at the United States, I can give you the number of Stanford. Stanford, the English department has 43 professors, of whom 3 are specialists in literature. Yeah? There is no philological production that is nationally American. Now, I'm not saying this is the case because Americans are so wonderful, there's no American nationalism, but I think it is due to this specific history. There was never a moment of defeat, of humiliation. I mean, interestingly, the moment when American studies in America becomes an issue is the Vietnam War. Yeah, because, of course, from an Eastern perspective, you can say this is a defeat. I mean, it has never been officially admitted, but you can say it's a defeat. It is definitely internationally a moment of national humiliation. But before the Vietnam War, even those 3 positions for American studies didn't exist. So I find this an interesting case. My answer to your question is basically no. I mean, in England and in America, philology never became nationalistic, only I don't want to be misunderstood in the sense of saying, oh, we are so wonderful, we're the one nation that can be horribly nationalistic. I know that, but I think within the humanities, this has never happened. This was a precise answer. I normally don't have precise answers.
I remember the definition of philology by one of my teacher in Berlin, and as I know, your good friend Friedrich Hitler, with a sentence by Nietzsche, philology is slowly reading. And my question is, how is it possible, generally, everywhere, for today to read text slow? Or we need a new definition of philology for today?
I mean, Friedrich was a great friend, and Friedrich is one of the people in our profession, in the humanities of my generation, who I admire the most. I mean, no critique. This sentence, the quote Nietzsche and say philology is reading slow, has a little bit the non-virtue of being geistreich. Yeah? I mean, this is not a description of philology, really. I mean, what we call philology is text curatorship, not because I'm saying that, but I think this is what everybody understands. I mean, if you are within the humanities, you hear philology, may find that interesting or not. This is people who preserve texts. You know, who preserve texts under the condition that texts are the form of knowledge preservation. Yeah? So, okay, this is one thing. I don't think it's a good description of philology. But the quest that one of the pedagogical tasks of the humanities today would be slow reading, that is a very, very interesting assignment. And I'm saying that in two ways. In the first sense, when I teach undergraduate students at Stanford, and we have now many, many undergraduate students who do double major, so they have two specialties. One is computer science, electrical engineering, or symbolic systems. They are all about computers, and they do at the same time humanities. So they do one literature, comparative literature, or they do French literature, or they do philosophy. Yeah? Now, when I teach these students who are 17, 18 years old, I realize one thing, that their way of processing texts is absolutely fantastic. I mean, they can process text much better than I do. Yeah, they can. I mean, we were teaching, I mean, it was mentioned that on Monday, a seminar, I wanted to read 10 novels with them, they wanted 20 novels. And I get the impression that they're able to read 20 novels in one trimester. I cannot do that. Yeah. And I'm not saying because I'm so wonderful, no, I just don't manage. But at the same time, I think they have a hard time reading slowly. They have a hard time concentrating on what is the form of the text. They have a hard time, you see that in class. Say, okay, I brought for the Ulysses session 1 page of Ulysses from book 8. Just concentrate on that 1 page of Ulysses, and it is very tough for them to do that slowly. But I think if you don't oblige them to do that, but show them through your own example, didactically, what a kick, what a satisfaction, what an excitement, what an ecstasy you can get from focusing on 1 page. Then you begin, perhaps you initiate this existential function of the humanities of what I was talking about. This is not changing the electronic world, but creating a pocket within the electronic world of reading slowly, of having a life that is not only processing data, and that includes, for example, being able to focus on food, like you can in your culture. And this is something remarkable, how beautiful it looks when it comes to the table, how you talk about it, how you enjoy it. You initiate an existential move by reading slowly that makes life under present conditions not different, but more complex and more complete. And I was saying that because there is wine and there's food waiting for you.
Thank you so much. And in recognition, of your contribution to the humanities, and in appreciation of your presence here at Ilias State University, the university had decided to award you the honorary doctorate, and that's what we'll try to kind of conduct the ceremony now. Closing of the friendship is just beginning of a beautiful friendship, I'm really sure about between our universities.
I love the way my name looks in